morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of Raising the Bar Live, where we talk about all things business, health insurance, and family business related. So it is my pleasure today to introduce Josh Kanter from Leafplanner. That is his new company. He has a long history of working with family offices, and I think you're going to be really intrigued by how Leafplanner came to be and how Leafplanner can support those of you that have family offices and are planning on continuing passing on wealth. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Allison. It's really fun to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I am too. And I was so intrigued by what Leafplanner is and how you came to arrive at this. Can you talk a little bit about your journey through the family office and why you decided how you decided to create Leapfrog and why it's such an important tool?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. So I want to do this fairly quickly because otherwise I get down a rabbit hole about my whole history. But I'm originally a lawyer, was just kind of happily going about my business, building my law career. My father had been a world-renowned tax lawyer and venture capitalist, and he got somewhat unexpectedly, I guess it's always unexpected, but he got unexpectedly sick in 2000, and that put me in a position as part of a multi-generational, multi-branch family. We were 3 generations kind of up and down, 3 branches left and right, and put me in a position to really have to come in and help my family figure out how we can navigate through the loss of this patriarch and the complexity that came with his career and our family's balance sheet and enterprise structure and all these different things. And so I did that, and I actually had the good fortune of having 18 months with my dad before he passed away. And when he passed away, and I started working on the estate tax returns and just succession issues and all the things that come with families in business and families of wealth, and realized, oh my God, there's so much I don't know. And so I really started this focus almost 25 years ago, I guess 23 years ago, on how do you better think about all the things that families need to know, the questions that they face, the questions they don't even know that they should be addressing. And that ultimately became, first for our family 22 years ago, this thing that we kept calling the Family Owner's Manual. And then fast forwarding another 20 years, and about 3 years ago became Leafplanner. And the idea of helping families understand the questions to think about, how do you collect and share information? And when I say information, I really mean information, not documents. So documents can be a part of that, but it was really about how do you share this critical information that walks around in all of our heads. And anyway, that was the genesis for what's now become Leafplanner.
And Leafplanner has evolved into a whole suite of at least referrals to other sources, other types of services that family offices needs and that family businesses need. And I think as family businesses, family businesses often used to be quite small. And as they grow and grow and grow, and they become more complex and complex and complex, and they pass through 3 generations, how do you avoid that shirt sleeve to shirt sleeve kind of thing and get all that information out of somebody's head? Because it is all in somebody's head. I've recently gone through myself.
Yeah, I think I'm very sorry to have just heard about that. It's hard. It's really, really hard. I think 2 things. One is that one of the things that you're, I think, alluding to is we've built a host of what we refer to as community resources for our client families. And the idea there, and it's important that from my perspective, Leafplanner is really designed to help, really, I'll say almost any family. We do have a little bit of a focus and a lens of a single family office, but by no means is that, sort of a requirement or a limitation of where Leafplanner can be helpful. It really helps across the wealth spectrum. And I say that because to me, Leafplanner is really about taming complexity more so than it is about the number of zeros. And that was true in my own family, that we were pretty well off, but nevertheless, the level of complexity compared to the level of wealth was disproportionate. And in today's environment, and granted, you could argue this is a first world problem, but for a family that's got a couple of homes and a couple of cars and a couple of trusts and a couple of kids and a couple of insurance policies and a couple of private investments and a business or whatever, there's a lot of moving pieces. That family is wildly complex and probably way more complex than they give it credit for. So one of the things that I really realized, having spent the last, again, almost 25 years in the family office, to find a particular kind of resource. It's easy to go out to various famous networks and say, hey, I'm looking for this, that, or the other. And frankly, if I needed to find you, I would probably be able to find you through all of my family office contacts. But
Yep.
most people don't have those resources. And so we've started to build this community resource section that's available for Leafplanner clients who we have nothing to do with it. It's really just we know these people, we trust them, much like you, right? And so it's, if a family comes in and says, hey, I'm looking for a documentarian, I'm looking for ancestry research, I'm looking for a risk consultant, I'm looking for help in the insurance space, specifically the health insurance space or something like that, we want to have these resources available that are really just augmenting the value of what Leafplanner does. The other issue that you really just touched on, is how do you get all of this information out of everybody's heads? And that is tricky. And people, again, I don't mean to make this like overly sexist, and it doesn't really matter who you put at the top of that pyramid, but there's typically, whether it's the patriarch, the matriarch, the CEO, the property manager, information's everywhere. And so it's really important to think about how do you bring it all together.
Having experienced this a little bit on my own lately, and I was left in relatively good shape, but it was like I would find things and I'd be like, what is this? What? And nothing terrible, nothing whatever, but it was, every day was an adventure for a while.
Yeah.
And I think you've done such a good job of helping people not have to have that adventure. There's always going to be something. I just think
there will always be something.
There's going to be one thing that is like, what is this? But to not have that venture. And, we just had a couple of family calls about children and nieces and nephews and trusts and all of those kind of things. And, what's in my head and what's in your head and what's in this head over here, even when everybody is, there's no imminent demise of anybody, you still need to get that out of people's heads. And I think one of the other things that you do so well is help educate children and grandchildren about their responsibility to the family office. I think that's a two-way street, right? And
Yep.
I think that's really important too. Would you like to see more of that? Is there enough of that? Is there not nearly enough of that?
I think there's not nearly enough of that. I think so. First, going back for 1 second to something you said, I think there will always be something. I think it's really interesting. I came across, as a part of Leafplanner, a lot of things have changed for me over the last 3 years, and my own knowledge and what I've been coming across. And anyway, I come across this. I think it's a Buddhist saying of pain is inevitable, suffering is optional.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, because it is, to your point, like, we're going to lose our loved ones. We're going to lose people who hold knowledge. We're going to lose them because we love them. We're going to lose them because they're knowledgeable. We're going to lose them for all kinds of reasons. But the suffering part of that, in my mind, and where Leafplanner steps into that void, is to say, but some of this doesn't need to be. You don't need to wait for the mail to show up to figure out, is the utility bill on auto pay, right? You don't need to make sure that you're going through mom and dad's email to figure out, is there something that's got to get paid or whatever, or that they had an account somewhere that you didn't know about. And even in my own case, when my dad passed away, I jokingly, one of the things I always joke about is that I came across a safe deposit box receipt that had no date and no bank name on it. And so to this day, and totally as a joke, but I totally jokingly say, I don't know if there's a safe deposit box with $1 million of gold sitting in it. And the good news is, my family are basically Jewish descendants from Eastern Europe. I know it's not family recipes, because there are no good recipes in the family. So it's your point. There's always going to be something, but the more we can minimize that. First of all, you're talking about, I know there's all kinds of, I'm a lawyer, not a psychologist, but there's all kinds of psychology, right, around not making decisions. And for example, the first 90 days after a trauma. Well, what is a death in a family but a trauma?
And requires many, 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 many decisions. Very
and
quick.
It requires many decisions. So the more we can help ease that process and give people time to actually, and this isn't always about death, but give people in that death instance, give people time to grieve. The communication piece and the education and responsible ownership, I'll say, for rising generation family members, to me, is critically important. I think the industry, right, the wealth industry has made some really great strides in that respect, starting with Jay Hughes's work, 30, 40, 50 years ago,
Mhm.
and now coming forward. But it's really coming into its own. And I think it's really great to see much more focus on what does the well-being of the family mean, not just building wealth, but the wealth of the family.
Yep.
And Jay does a wonderful job of talking about that the origin of the word wealth is really not about money. It's about the wealth of the family, or the well-being of the family.
Right.
Um, that the skill set of communication and sharing knowledge, and people often think about sharing knowledge and transparency as a binary. If I'm going to talk to my kids about our wealth, I have to share with them the balance sheet. And that freaks a lot of people out.
Sure.
But I try to make sure people understand transparency is a continuum. It's not a binary yes or no question. And so you can start, I mean, we've had in our family, we had the cousins, sort of the next generation, started coming to family meetings when they were probably 7 or 8 years old. It wasn't like, oh, here's the balance sheet. First of all, they wouldn't know how to read it. But here's the balance sheet. It was about, how do you start talking about family values? How do you start talking about the purpose of the family's wealth? All these different kinds of things. And my hope is that Leafplanner helps families bring these conversations to the table and is a central part of that conversation.
And I think that's so important. I used to go on a truck with my dad. I worked for my father for a while. I learned a lot of how I think about things came from that. If I hadn't
Mm-hmm.
had the time, if I had that time with him, I would not think the things that I think. And I think that's so, you know, I think you can relate this to the conversations about the birds and the bees. You have a different conversation at age 5 with what the questions are than at age 13, that age 18 and 25 and 40. Um, it is a continuum,
Yeah.
but you have to start somewhere. And I think people are so afraid to start,
Yeah.
particularly in family
Yeah.
businesses where there can be real world consequences to inappropriate sharing of information. Um, I've
Yeah.
seen some,
Yeah.
our clients are mostly family-owned businesses with 40, 50 to 1,000 employees, right? So
Mm-hmm.
how they bring their children into the business, and the children that wanna come and the children that don't wanna come, and, how some of them pull them in right away and some of them send them off for a little bit. One of my favorite, they're not my client, but they're a company in my orbit. They're the 4th generation, just came into the business, but the 4th generation went to college, went to grad school, worked in London for a number of years before coming back into the business, but has a very good understanding of how that business operates. And I think that to me
Yeah.
was the most successful transition that I've seen. They've been educated, they've been exposed to things elsewhere, and now they can take it to the next place that the family wants to take that business. And I think that
Yeah.
that percolates all the way through that business, because that is a family business for 70 years, and over 40% of their workforce has worked for them for more than 20 years. So clearly it's a really good place to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, and buried in all those things that you're saying, right, are so many different tangents and offshoots, because the importance to the family of whether that business is
mhm,
part of their legacy. Well, of course, it's part of their legacy, but how important is that legacy? And that often can be viewed differently between the family members who are in the business and those who are not. And interestingly, I worked with a family recently, and it was there were smallish family, 4th generation as you're describing, but smallish family, and there were 2 brothers at the rising generation. One is in the business, one is not in the business. But the legacy meant more to the kid who was not in the business than it did to the one
mhm,
who's in the business. And so understanding the legacy, understanding that this isn't just about your family, right? This is about the
mhm,
community in which your business is operating and the hundreds of families that depend
yep,
on your company now. right? That as you were describing, um, it depends on people understanding their roles and responsibilities as owners and managers and executives and trustees and beneficiaries and all of these different things. It matters to understand maybe it's not a wholly owned family business and there's a partner, and are there buy sell agreements, and are there insurance provisions to help figure out what happens when all of a sudden there's two families, or to your point, family members maybe from either side of that equation coming into the business, and what are the rules? Do you have to go out and get that experience that you described in that family? Do you automatically get to come into the business? How do you move up through those ranks? What does that do to your employees when they say, oh, this kid just came in and he doesn't have the qualifications and he's here because his name is Kanter? That's not a great thing necessarily. So again, anyway, there's so many complex issues that come up, especially as you move through the generations. And even continuing to own a family business, but not have
Mhm.
family members running it,
I
as I'm
do.
sure you see often after 2 or 3 generations when maybe there's nobody
Yep.
interested or qualified. And now you've turned to outside management, but the family legacy is still tied up in
And
owning
often in the name.
that community resource. So
Often in the name.
yeah,
So it's
yeah, really
so,
interesting stuff.
I'm gonna go a little bit off topic, but I think it's important. One of the things that I've been kind of mulling over as I see how our different clients respond to their employees differently is there's a lot of conversation about treating people like family. And I don't know that that's the right thing, but I do think that businesses they're starting to be their own communities. And I think that this
Hmm.
whole idea of, being a community rather than a family, you support your community, right? There are things that you do in your community to support your community. You may or may not get paid for them. You do them because you live in the community, right? And I think that businesses, successful businesses, are starting to adopt that more. And I've seen the family businesses take a lead on that. They're starting, as they grow,
Hmm.
they're like, oh, well, we can't do that anymore. We need to be a little bit more structured, but they still take care.
Hmm.
How do you,
Yeah.
besides bringing kids into family meetings and family discussions, how do you instill that? How do you communicate philanthropic tenets of the family? Our family, some people are really,
Yeah.
really very philanthropic and others aren't.
Hmm. Hmm. So I think I'll separate two of those things, right? I mean, I agree with you that especially smaller, and depending on what you mean by smaller, I mean, this could still be thousands of employees, but smaller family-owned businesses that
Mhm.
are within their community, that are, to your point, I think are really treating their employees and their employee families as whether it's family or whether it's a sense of community, as you're saying. And I think community is, I agree with you, is the better way of maybe looking at that. And I think that's really important. And I think that goes back to, the legacy and communication. And frankly, then moving to the family side is, do family members understand how much is that a motivating or important force and value for mom and dad or whoever the,
Yep.
senior generation in the family is, and how do those things all play out? I think when we see it on the family side, of thinking about the values and some of these things that come into this, and whether it's philanthropy or again that sense of community, which could be philanthropic, and it could just be the business and how we treat people within the business. It could be lots of different things. We see, or I see, in the families that I work with, both with my Leafplanner hat and my Josh hat, uh, really a lot of focus on helping to share again those values, identify those values, share them, talk about them, really understand what they mean, to really be able to think about again, what is the purpose of this wealth or this business or this
Mhm.
creation that
Work so
we've
hard.
built, and passing that on. And I think even to your story about driving around with your dad in the truck, is families, I think, tend to think that everybody understands these things implicitly, and they may. But to your point, there's a lot of things that impacted you by having that opportunity to drive around with your dad that
Yep.
you wouldn't have otherwise known. And so understanding, frankly, even just some of the grit or whatever you want to call it, and how you got from point A to point B, especially when you're talking, I think, about younger kids who grew up in an environment where they already saw that the
Mhm.
wealth had been created. So when my parents were creating a lot of their wealth, I have to say, I was young, but I was a teenager when a lot of this was happening. So I saw it happening. I understood more about it because I was kind of living it. But obviously, a lot of family members come in and that wealth's already been created. And so the assumption is that mom and dad went from here to here in a straight line,
And
from
it's not.
bottom left to top right. And that ain't how the world works, right? And so again, I had a great story working with a family that had built a really successful business, and I was running some family meetings for them, and we had up and essentially tell the story, even though the kids had heard all the stories a million times, right? But I asked him, I want you to lay out a timeline. I want you to lay out what happened. And as he's laying out this timeline, and he gets to a point where he says, well, and this is when I left the company I was with, and I borrowed $100,000 from the bank, and was obviously a personal guarantor on it. And that's the money that started the company that built the family's wealth. And all of a sudden, one of the kids realizes the timing of this and says, wait a second, time out. You're telling me you left your job and borrowed $100,000 when I was like an infant and mom was pregnant with my sibling? Are you kidding? That's the risk you took, right? And so this was the first time it had dawned on them to understand the timeline of how risky that was for mom and dad to make that decision.
Mhm.
That dad was going to leave his job and go into debt in order to do this, right? And so it's really important to understand that, and understand the values behind that and the purpose behind it. So
I think it's
there
always.
can't be enough. You can't over.
No, you can't. So, do we still have you? Yes, okay. So I think that you can't over
Yes.
communicate those things, and it's always amazing to me how you think you know everything about your family, and then you have a conversation, and it can be a conversation like that. It doesn't have to be as structured as a meeting, and it's like, "Wait, what? You did what?" And how I think as a child, you often think that your parents, they're just successful and everything was easy, and that is so rarely the case.
Yeah.
Even if there's no financial stress, there's always something that's happening. So, I wanna switch gears just a little bit.
Yeah.
Family businesses are much more common, they're much bigger. Um, how do you address the tech and security issues that running a family office requires? Are you there?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry, I lost you for a second. I hope it's not my
No worries.
connection, but
How do you
I'm
address the
losing you a
tech and
little bit. I don't know
security
why.
issues that a family office I'm gonna Can you hear me now?
Mm.
Okay. How do you address the
The
tech and
tech
security issues that
and
are becoming
security
so
issues in a
important?
family office?
Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, it's again, obviously, it's getting to be a more and more complex world in both tech and security, and families of wealth, and certainly family business owners whose names are in the newspaper and everything else are becoming targets of all these things. So
Mhm.
I think from making sure that your vendors are um, operating within the security sort of protocols that they should be. For example, on Leafplanner side, we were seeing a tremendous amount of very, very sensitive. Really important to us that we, of course, have all the standard industry certifications, ISO certifications, SOC 2 certifications, all that kind of thing. And then we think we're taking steps at the cutting edge of cybersecurity to make sure people's data is protected, and those kinds of things. I don't know a company at the moment anywhere who's not engaging in training around phishing and around uh, all the different kind of malware
Yep.
that's out there. And it used to be you could just run your little Norton antivirus thing, and you could feel pretty good about it. And now it's
Apparently
it's
not
just
anymore.
so incredibly, yeah, it's so incredibly sophisticated.
Yep.
So
So before we wrap up, I
um,
have one more question for you.
you know,
Are we cutting out again?
working with vendors, obviously that you really makes, but honest mistake is really serious consequences.
Yes, they do. Before we wrap up, tell me what you think the future of the family office is.
I think what's exciting for me in the family office world right now, I mean, two things I'll say, because I see a little bit of a divergence. One is that, there's obviously been, and you could pick up the newspaper every few days. And for those people who still pick up a newspaper, I guess, so you could pick up the newspaper every few days and read about kind of the explosion in the family office world, right? That there's so many new family offices being created because obviously there's been a huge, tremendous influx of wealth and liquidity events and things like that. I think, though, that a lot of that is really creating what I would really refer to more as the investment office than the family office. And those are people who do have all of a sudden a lot of liquidity. They're really looking at setting up an independent investment arm. What I think is exciting in what I'll call the true family office world is really this focus. And again, I'll say Jay started this, I think, 40 years ago, just continuing, is the focus on the family's the family wealth or the family well-being. Really,
Yes.
you're seeing an explosion, not an explosion. You're seeing a growth in family offices that are hiring a chief learning officer. That I'm really excited about where the family office world is going. And then the tech solutions that are helping us get there, including, I'll say, Leafplanner, that's really about education, empowerment, engagement, and succession. But there's a lot of really exciting things, I think, happening in the landscape.
So I think we'll wrap it up there. If you have a family office, please check out leafplanner.com. It is a remarkable tool for family cohesion, not just family wealth, I think. So thank you for joining me today, Josh, and we
Yeah.
will see you